We're going to be hearing two more papers this afternoon, first from Tracy Lee Simmons, and then later from Professor Carl Richard, who I'll introduce after. But first of all, I want to introduce Tracy Simmons, who holds an MA from the University of Oxford. He is currently the director of the Herbert Dow Chair in Journalism at Hillsdale College. And most recently, he is the author of Climbing Parnassus, a new apologia for Greek and Latin. His talk this afternoon is entitled Thomas Jefferson, Humanism and Classical Education.
Thank you to the Hauenstein Center. And this conference has been about lessons, and the lesson I'm taking right now is that if you have, as a speaker, no audiovisual aids, do not follow someone who has. Lessons for President Obama. I would like to start with a suggestion, which is that he should get rid of the teleprompter, and instead of having those awkward pieces of glass standing up in front of him, instead he should have festooned in front of his lectern perhaps two Grecian-looking vases with shrubbery in them. I would like to set aside my classical training for a bit and talk about what's been touched about on this side a little bit, which is classical humanism. And to look at one of the founders, Thomas Jefferson, who exemplified that ideal most perfectly. And I always have to begin any talk about humanism by doing a little reclamation work on the word itself. We usually hear it today with that barnacle-attached secular. And it's used always pejoratively, and I don't deny that something called secular humanism exists, but it's not what I mean when I talk about humanism, and it's not principally, I think, what Jefferson meant by it. So we live in a world where, of course, we pay a lot of lip service to the founders, and they deserve it. But I want to reflect just a little bit for the moment on how they got to be who they were, and how did they get to know all these things. We've heard references to Plato and Thucydides and others. Most of the founders had read these works. They had read them in school, often before they attended college or university. And I want to talk about that, the world that came from. To talk about Thomas Jefferson in the light of the reflected glow of Greek and Roman antiquity ought to be a superfluous exercise, and perhaps it is in this room. But I have found in my travels in hawking a book on classical education that many people, and I mean good, intelligent, curious citizens, seem to think that the man arose fully equipped from birth with the will and the massive intellect he would later use to put himself on the nickel. To these people, he might have been a force of nature. He doesn't need explaining, he simply is, sui generis. A phrase he would not have needed a crib sheet to understand. Others, again, I find, think he was solely a man of the 18th century Enlightenment, and was therefore, so this popular notion runs, willing and eager to throw off the past as if it were a set of shackles binding us to the dungeon of tradition. This is the fellow, after all, who said that a revolution every once in a while wouldn't be such a bad thing. These people hear that lovely Jeffersonian sentence he once wrote in a letter to John Adams about preferring the dreams of the future to the history of the past. And they conclude that here was a man who lived for the new and the untried and inhabited possible alternative worlds of the mind, but not the real one. And so the sense now many people have that he was more a man of the future than of the past comes with handsome and munificent support. Jefferson was certainly no hidebound traditionalist, and anybody out to make him into an impressive monument of reliable conservatism would be doing some violence to the truth. The Founding Fathers were, as we would say today, a fairly diverse group of people, certainly in personality. They were racked with disagreements, which could and did in a few cases disintegrate into vendetta. And yet, on closer look, the popular copybook idea of Jefferson as the liberal doesn't quite hold up either. Because he was not, while he was not a conservative in the most modern senses of the word, neither was he a rootless radical, as I heard him once described. Anyone who knows the derivations of those words, when you put them together, that's a bit of a contradiction. Certainly, he could perpetrate strange and rash and silly ideas with the best of them, and of course, given the power of his pen, rather better than most. But I've come to look at him differently. I would say that he felt free to cast his mind so broadly and sometimes wildly into realms even of the ridiculous, simply because he was so well grounded in the Western tradition. No matter how high he'd fly, he always remained intellectually within sight of terra firma, another term he didn't need any help with. He was, in fact, a student of that tradition, the tradition, first of all, of law and statesmanship, but just as much a student of the wider tradition of learning, the restless quest for knowledge that we find with such a breezy freshness in the Greeks of the 5th and 4th century BC. Had there been no Socrates 1,000 years before to ask, or a couple thousand years before, to ask the primary questions and stir up the still waters of mental and spiritual laziness, Jefferson might not have been armed with the intellectual boldness to joust and to sup with Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau. In short, he spoke within the Western tradition, not outside of it. He could not have made himself a fully versed participant in the great conversation of ideas otherwise. And as we all know, true conversation requires a large measure of equality. For in the house of intellect, sometimes you need leaders, sometimes you need followers, but mostly you need colleagues. And that is what his education, certainly his formal one, had prepared him to do, to break bread with the dead. And just how much more conversant can we expect one to be with the past than to be able to parley with its major players? Indeed, Jefferson used to describe his reading of the classical authors in their original Greek and Latin as a direct conversation with them. So Thomas Jefferson was a humanist, by which I mean the kind that arose from the Renaissance and sought both systematically and fancifully to pull back the knowledge and wisdom of the ancient world, and here's the point, and here's the trick, to keep that treasure always before his mind. It's not simply something, it's not simply a degree he earned at one time and forgot about later. He wasn't a dry-as-dust scholar. For the humanist, the beneficent one of the old kind, strives first for a nobility of soul and knows that this can be achieved only one soul at a time. It elevates the individual, not the collective, and therefore is probably not the stuff of government programs. The classical humanist deems history as a long caravan of men and women, of human beings, not massive shifting plates of ideology. And he tends to devalue this idea of retrospective movements in history. The humanist's view was imbued with the historical sense. People thought historically, to use Professor Fear's term from last night. They thought historically. That is, they thought of the present as standing at a certain tight angle to the past. And it's an angle that they wish to get right, because it could go awry.